The guest in the master closet. It happened just a few months ago, during that strange, unsettling gap between graduating college and starting my first real job in June. Having finished my degree a semester early, I was drowning in free time and feeling a growing sense of worthlessness. When my mother asked if I could drive down to Rehoboth Beach to check on my Uncle Rick's vacation home, I jumped at the chance just to feel productive again. The drive from Pennsylvania to Delaware was only 2 hours, a simple trip to ensure no pipes were leaking and the property was secure before the summer rush. The house itself is a massive structure, the kind of place designed to hold 25 members of my extended family at once. Usually it is filled with the chaotic sounds of board games and relatives drinking too much, but arriving there alone on a random Thursday was a different experience entirely. The silence was heavy and thick, making the house feel less like a home and more like an abandoned shell. After running through Rick's maintenance checklist and testing the faucets, I realized it was getting late. I've always hated driving at night, so I texted my mom to let her know I'd just stay over and head back in the morning. Normally, when the whole family is there, I am relegated to one of the cramped, uncomfortable rooms on the 3rd floor. However, with the entire house to myself, I decided to take advantage of the master suite on the 2nd floor. It was a beautiful room with a ridiculously comfortable bed and a large, deep walk-in closet. I drifted off around midnight, feeling safe behind the locked front door. But sometime later, a sharp, muffled thump coming from inside the closet startled me into a state of absolute alertness. I lay there, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I thought it might give me away. I was gripped by a physical paralysis born of pure terror. I could move, but I was too terrified to even twitch. Through squinted eyes, I watched in horror as the closet door slowly creaked open. A dark figure stepped out into the moonlight of the bedroom. He didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked to the side of the bed and just stood there. For 20 agonizing seconds, he remained perfectly still, looking down at me while I pretended to be asleep. Finally, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps creaking not toward the stairs leading out, but up toward the 3rd floor. The realization that he had gone up where there were no other exits sent a wave of nausea through me. I worked up the courage to grab my phone and dial 911, whispering my location to the dispatcher as I crawled out of bed and silently turned the lock on the master bedroom door. When the police arrived and swept the house, they initially told me it was empty and that the man must have slipped out. I refused to believe it. I called Uncle Rick, who stayed on the phone and yelled at the officers to do a more thorough search, insisting my life depended on it. During the 2nd search, the officers found an unlocked window in one of the 3rd floor bedrooms, the very room I usually slept in. We stepped out onto the back deck so the police could scan the exterior, and that's when the flashlight beam hit him. He was sitting right there on the roof. He was a disgusting-looking bald man in tattered clothing, looking as though he hadn't bathed in years. He didn't fight or run. He just stared with a vacant, eerie expression as they took him down in handcuffs. To this day, Uncle Rick won't explain how someone could have reached that roof from the ground, and I can't stop thinking about how that night would have ended if I had just slept in my usual bed on the 3rd floor. The silent alarm. My friend Mike has a beach house on the Jersey Shore that has been in his family for generations. It is a magnificent property, though it had been sitting dormant since his grandparents passed away and his parents were too busy to visit. Since it was the off-season and difficult to rent out, Mike had free access to it whenever he wanted. In mid-July, he invited me down for a low-stakes weekend of fishing, hitting the boardwalk, and escaping the daily grind. We arrived on a Friday, dropped our bags in the upstairs bedrooms, and spent the evening enjoying the salt air and the quiet pockets of the private beach. The first night was peaceful, and the next day followed suit with a morning run and hours spent under the sun. By Saturday night, we were both wiped out and decided to crash early rather than hit the crowded bars in Seaside. Sometime after midnight, I was jolted awake by a shrill, piercing, beeping sound. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the high-pitched alarm was real and cutting straight through the darkness. I scrambled out of bed, realizing the sound wasn't coming from my floor, but from somewhere directly above me on the third level of the house. I bolted into Mike's room, jolting him awake, and the two of us raced up the stairs, unsure if we were running into a fire or something worse. The third floor was dark, save for a bit of moonlight, and we frantically flipped on the lights to search for smoke or flames. We found nothing. No smell of burning, no flickering lights. After several minutes of searching for the source of that god-awful noise, I reached under a pillow in one of the guest bedrooms and pulled out a small black device. It was the size of a walkie-talkie with a blinking red light and a single manual switch on the side. Confused, I flipped the switch and the alarm stopped instantly. Mike and I stood there in total silence, staring at the jet-black casing. Mike swore that none of his family had been in the house for months, and the device certainly wasn't a standard smoke detector. As we sat in the dark trying to make sense of it, a terrifying thought occurred to me. I flipped the switch back and off. The alarm triggered and silenced perfectly. We both froze as the reality hit us. That device had no remote or automatic trigger. The only way for that alarm to have started blaring while we were asleep was for someone to have stood in that room and flipped the switch by hand. Terrified, Mike dialed the police while I barricaded the door. When the officers arrived and performed a sweep, they found a scene that looked nothing like the neat rooms we had just searched. Every single window on the third floor had been thrown wide open, and the rooms were completely ransacked. Beds were flipped, drawers were pulled out of dressers, and belongings were scattered across the floor. Despite the chaos, the intruder had vanished into the night, leaving no prints or weapons behind. We left the house as soon as the sun came up, haunted by the fact that someone had been standing over us in the dark, waiting for us to hear the alarm. The Midnight Pursuit. I have never been a party girl. While others my age spent their nights in clubs, I preferred a routine of work, the gym, and reading at home. I was 22, living back in my childhood home to save money and generally keeping to myself. But when my closest friend from college, Lindsay, invited me along with our friends Sabrina and Thea to her family's beach house for a weekend, I couldn't say no. Lindsay's family was incredibly wealthy. Both her parents were neurosurgeons, and their home was an ultra-modern marvel that looked more like a covert military safe house than a vacation property. It sat on a private stretch of beach, tucked away from the typical tourist chaos. On our first night, we decided to keep things low-key. We headed down to the private beach with a speaker and some drinks, sitting in the sand and stargazing. The atmosphere was perfect until we noticed a faint flickering light moving toward us from the distance. As it got closer, we realized it was a handheld flashlight carried by a group of 3 guys. They seemed friendly enough, laughing and making small talk as they approached. They had that typical beach boy look, and I could tell my friends, especially Thea, were immediately interested. We spent about an hour drinking and talking with them, but as the night wore on, I felt exhaustion setting in. The guys eventually invited us back to their place to continue the night. While my 3 friends were eager to go, I decided to call it a night. I told them to have fun, walked back to the safety of Lindsay's modern fortress, washed up, and fell into a deep sleep. That sleep was shattered at 3 a.m. by a FaceTime call from Lindsay. When I answered, groggy and confused, she was screaming into the phone. Through her sobs, she told me that Thea and Sabrina had been kidnapped and that I needed to get to her car immediately. The adrenaline hit me like a bucket of ice water. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely pull on my clothes as I sprinted down the stairs. Lindsay stayed on the line, her voice trembling as she walked me through opening the driveway gate and finding her keys. She told me she had already called the police but needed me to find them. She directed me to drive left down the beach road, describing the SUV the men were driving. I slammed on the gas, driving at an insanely unsafe speed through the deserted coastal streets. After a few minutes of frantic searching, I spotted a vehicle matching her description moving slowly in the distance. I quickly hung up with Lindsay and called the police back, giving the dispatcher our exact location. They told me to keep my distance so as not to alert the kidnappers that they were being followed. The next few minutes felt like hours until I finally saw the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers cutting through the dark. The SUV pulled over, likely assuming it was a routine traffic stop, but the scene quickly turned into pure chaos. Officers swarmed the vehicle with guns drawn, forcibly removing the three men and slamming them onto the pavement in handcuffs. I watched from a distance, my heart in my throat, as an officer walked to the back of the SUV and wrenched open the trunk. Inside, they found Thea and Sabrina. They were bound, gagged, and visibly bruised from the struggle. The full story was even more horrifying. Lindsay, who had tried to stay relatively sober as the host, realized too late that the men had drugged the other two girls. When she tried to intervene, they became violent, forcing the girls into the vehicle, while Lindsay narrowly escaped and hid to make the phone call. We are all still in contact today, but the trauma of that night has never truly left us. It was a chilling reminder that even in the most exclusive, safe locations, a friendly face can hide the most monstrous intentions.